October the 8th, 2025. A private room inside the Apostolic Palace, a laptop balanced on the arm of a chair, and a pope who did not know when he sat down that morning that within 15 minutes he would be fighting to keep his composure in front of 5 strangers from a border town in Texas. This is not a legend. It is not a rumor passed between Catholic forums. It happened in front of witnesses. It was reported within hours by wire services on 3 continents, and the people who watched it happen are still talking about it today. Nobody in that room expected tears. They had come with a box. Bishop Mark Seitz of El Paso had carried that box across an ocean. Inside it were more than 100 letters, handwritten, some in shaking cursive, some in careful block print gathered from immigrants across the United States who believed they might be deported. Within weeks, Seitz was not alone. Beside him stood Monsignor Arturo Bañuelas, one of the most outspoken immigrant advocates in the El Paso Church. Auxiliary Bishop Anthony Calino held a laptop. Dylan Corbett, the director of the Hope Border Institute, carried something else entirely. A short video stitched together from the voices of people who were too afraid to travel to Rome themselves. They had 15 minutes with the Holy Father. 15 minutes to make a pope, a man who had spent decades as a missionary among the poor of Peru, understand what it felt like to lie awake at night wondering if immigration agents would be waiting outside your door by morning. They did not need all 15 minutes to see it work. Before we get to what happened when the laptop opened, we have to understand who was sitting across from that delegation, because the man in white that day was not simply reacting as a head of state, might react to a diplomatic briefing. He was reacting as someone who had lived for more than 20 years among people, exactly like the ones in those letters. Robert Francis Prevost was born in Chicago in 1955. He became an Augustinian friar, and in the 1980s he was sent to Peru to the Diocese of Chiclayo, where he would spend the better part of 2 decades among rural farmers, migrant laborers, and families displaced by poverty and conflict. He learned Spanish not in a classroom in Rome, but in the parishes of northern Peru, hearing confession from people whose entire lives could be upended by a single bad harvest or a single official with the wrong signature. He became a bishop there. He became, eventually, a Peruvian citizen, taking on the nationality of the people he served. When he was elected pope, in the spring of 2025, becoming the first American to hold the office, commentators searched for a word to describe him. And the word that kept surfacing was missionary, not diplomat, not theologian, first missionary. That detail matters more than it might seem to because it explained something that puzzled a few observers in the days after October the 8th. Why would a pope, a man trained to project calm authority to 1 billion-plus Catholics, allow his composure to crack in front of a delegation from a mid-sized American diocese? The answer, according to the people who were in the room, is that he wasn't performing anything. He was remembering. The meeting began the way most Vatican audiences begin formally, briefly, with an exchange of greetings and gratitude. Bishop Seitz, who chairs the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on Migration, handed over the bundle of letters first. One of them, written in Spanish by a member of a mixed-status family, asked the Pope to pray for the President of the United States, so that his heart may be filled with love, compassion, and empathy. Another letter, tucked among the others, carried a plainer raw line, a note that simply said in Spanish, "Pope Leo, please listen to the cry of those who are being marginalized." Leo read some of them there in front of the delegation, and then Zeno opened the laptop. What played was not long. It was not cinematic. It was a compilation built from the same letters and testimonies the Hope Border Institute had spent months collecting of ordinary people, speaking directly into a camera about what daily life had become for them. Families, snorts, who did not know if a parent would come home from work. Children asking why they had stopped going to church because their families were afraid to be seen gathering in public voices. That, as Corbett would describe it afterward, opened by talking about a feeling of powerlessness, a word that seemed to strike the Pope immediately. According to Corbett, who spoke to multiple outlets in the days that followed, Leo's reaction did not wait for the video to finish. He just was you could see visibly pained when he watched the video, Corbett told Time magazine. He said the Pope grew emotional, that his eyes filled that. At certain points he seemed almost angry, not at the people in the room, but at the situation. The video described Corbett would later say, "The Pope told them plainly that what was happening amounted to a real injustice, and that the Church needed to be unified and unambiguous in opposing it." 15 minutes. That was the window Sight's delegation had been given. Several of them, Corbett admitted afterward, weren't sure going in whether they would even get through the letters, let alone the video, before an aide appeared to end the audience. But nobody rushed them out. The Pope sat with what he had just seen. And when he spoke, according to Bishop Sight's own account to the Associated Press afterward, he did not offer vague comfort. He made a promise. "You stand with me," Leo told them, "and I stand with you." He added something that would be repeated in headlines across the Catholic press within hours, that the Church could not remain silent in the face of what these families were living through. It is worth pausing here on a detail that gets lost in the shorter versions of this story. Snorts. The identity of the people who were actually in that room. Besides the bishops, Hilda Villegas from a Chamizal neighborhood group called Familias Unidas was there. So was Father Jose Morales, the pastor of a Catholic parish in El Paso. So was Astrid Leiden of the Hope Border Institute. These were not Vatican officials or career diplomats. They were in the truest sense ordinary parish workers and community organizers from a border city. Most Romans have never had a reason to think about, and a pope who governs over 1.4 billion Catholics gave them not a photo opportunity, but his genuine visible grief. Why does this matter? Because it tells us something about what kind of pope the Catholic Church elected in 2025, and it helps explain a pattern that has continued ever since. This was not an isolated moment of emotion quickly forgotten. It was the clearest public expression up to that point of a stance Leo XIV had been building since the earliest days of his pontificate, a conviction shaped by his own decades among the poor of Peru, that the migrant crisis unfolding in the United States was not a political abstraction, but a wound the Church was obligated to name. In the months before that October meeting, Leo had already spoken carefully, but unmistakably about the dignity owed to migrants and the danger of policies that treated human beings as problems to be processed, rather than people to be protected. He had done so without wading into the specifics of American partisan politics by name, choosing instead the language every pope before him has used when addressing injustice, the language of human dignity, of the Church's duty to the vulnerable, of Scripture's repeated command to welcome the stranger. But on October the 8th, that careful general language met something specific and irreducibly human. 100 handwritten letters and a 6-minute video of real families describing real fear. And in that meeting, the abstraction collapsed. What was left was a man with tears in his eyes. There is a particular kind of moment that documentary filmmakers chase for years, and rarely find the moment when a public figure's private conviction becomes visible, unscripted in front of witnesses who have no reason to exaggerate what they saw. This was that moment. Corbett was not a Vatican spokesman crafting a press release. He was a border town nonprofit director who had spent years watching immigrant families in El Paso live under exactly this kind of fear, and who walked out of that audience still slightly stunned that the leader of the Catholic Church had let his guard down in front of him. It is also worth noting what Leo did not do. He did not turn the meeting into a political statement aimed at a single administration. He did not issue a decree. What he offered instead was solidarity, a promise to stand with a specific group of frightened families delivered in the plainest words available to him. In an institution that often communicates through centuries-old ritual and carefully translated encyclicals, "You stand with me and I stand with you," is about as direct as papal language gets. The story did not end when the delegation walked out of the Apostolic Palace. Bishop Seitz brought the Pope's words back to El Paso, where they spread quickly through parishes that the previous months bracing for immigration raids. Corbett shared the same video the Pope had watched publicly on social media, so that the families who had recorded those testimonies could see that their voices had reached Rome and had been received, not filed away, but felt. For a community that often describes itself as forgotten, squeezed between two countries, watched by cameras on both sides of a river, discussed constantly in the news and rarely listened to directly, that mattered enormously. There is a broader pattern here too, one that becomes visible only when you step back from this single meeting and look at Leo XIV's public life since his election. This was, by the accounts of those close to him, not the only time he has been visibly moved during his pontificate. Journalists and clergy who have observed him at Mass have described him growing emotional during the consecration, his eyes filling as he lifts the host, a moment that has circulated widely among Catholic viewers, precisely because it feels so unguarded. Those who covered his first blessing after his election described a man who appeared moved nearly to tears by the scale of what had just happened to him. None of these moments on their own would be remarkable for any single human being standing at an altar or receiving devastating news from strangers. What makes them remarkable is that they are happening to the Pope, a man whose every public gesture is now permanently a matter of historical record, studied by theologians, replayed by television networks, picked apart by millions of strangers on the internet within hours, and yet Leo XIV has not appeared to guard against these moments. If anything, those closest to the events describe someone who seems almost incapable of performing detachment when the story in front of him is real. A missionary who spent his entire adult life listening to farmers in Chiclayo describe crop failures, and later listening to families describe fear of deportation, does not easily learn to watch a video of a mother describing her child's confusion about why they can no longer go to Mass without being moved by it. This raises the question documentary viewers usually want answered by the end of a piece like this one. What did it actually change? Words are easy for powerful men to offer, and promises made in 15-minute Vatican audiences do not on their own stop a single deportation. But something did shift in the weeks that followed. Leo's comments were picked up widely by American Catholic media and by outlets far outside the Church's usual orbit. Secular papers, cable news segments, border region radio stations that do not normally cover Vatican affairs at all. Bishop Seitz, already one of the most visible immigration advocates among American bishops, found his position reinforced at the highest level of the institution he serves. Catholic parishes in border communities, some of which had grown quieter out of fear that visibility itself was dangerous, found language from the Pope himself that they could now cite from the pulpit without stepping outside official church teaching. And the immigrant families whose letters had crossed the ocean in that box learned in the most concrete way available to them that the Pope had actually read what they wrote and had been moved enough by it that he could not entirely hide it. There is something instructive, too, in what Leo chose to emphasize when he spoke. He did not frame the migrants in that video as passive victims. Only Corbett would later describe the Pope's reaction to the fuller picture the video presented, not only fear but resilience. Not only families in crisis, but families who wanted more than anything simply to keep contributing to the American communities where they had built their lives. That distinction is easy to miss in a headline about a crying Pope, but it is central to understanding why the moment resonated the way it did. Leo was not simply moved by suffering. He was moved by dignity under pressure. People who, even while afraid, insisted on their right to belong, to work, to worship, to raise their children somewhere safe. That is precisely the kind of witness a former missionary bishop who spent decades watching poor communities insist on their own dignity in the face of much worse would recognize instantly. It would be tempting in telling this story to reduce it to a single, dramatic image, a pope with wet eyes, a viral clip, a headline built for clicks, but the deeper story is slower and in its way more remarkable. It is the story of an institution that spans more than 1 billion people headed by a man whose every gesture becomes global news within the hour, choosing in a 15-minute private audience to let 5 visitors from a border town see him exactly as he was. Not managing the moment, not performing sympathy for cameras that weren't even present, but simply present and undefended in front of the truth. Those letters carried historians of the papacy will likely spend years cataloging which moments defined Leo. The 14th's early pontificate, the encyclicals, the consistories, the reforms to Vatican finances, the doctrinal statements that will shape Catholic teaching for a generation. But it is worth remembering that a great deal of what makes a papacy resonate with ordinary Catholics has very little to do with formal documents. It has to do with moments like this one. A man in white in a private room watching strangers describe their fear on a borrowed laptop and not being able to hide what it did to him. Bishop Seitz put it simply when he described the exchange afterward. He said they had come to give the Pope something from the mouths of immigrants themselves, their situation, their experience, what they hoped he might do on their behalf. What they received in return was not a policy paper. It was a promise delivered through tears that a pope did not try. Particularly hard to conceal that the people who wrote those 100 letters were not alone, and that the man now leading the largest religious institution on earth had heard them, had believed them, and did not intend to stay quiet. To understand why this single audience carried the weight it did, it helps to look at the timing. October of 2025 sat in the middle of one of the most aggressive periods of immigration enforcement the United States had seen in decades. Reports of workplace raids, of parents detained in front of their children, of families splitting apart mid-shift at a job site had been surfacing weekly in cities far larger than El Paso. Border communities, like El Paso and its sister city across the river Ciudad Juarez, had lived with this tension for years, long before it became national news, because the border does not experience immigration policy as an abstraction. It experiences it as a neighbor who did not come home. Bishop Seitz had years positioning the El Paso diocese at the center of the American Church's response to this reality. He had walked beside migrants at the Paso del Norte crossing. He had written pastoral letters defending the dignity of undocumented families. He had, by the time he chaired the Bishops' Conference Committee on Migration, become one of the most recognized clerical voices on the subject in the entire country. When he chose to bring this particular fight directly to Rome in person with letters rather than statistics, he was making a calculated decision about what kind of evidence might actually reach a pope who had by then already shown signs of taking the migration crisis personally. That calculation paid off in a way even Seitz may not have fully anticipated. Diplomatic audiences at the Vatican are by their nature controlled environments. Popes meet with dozens of delegations every month, offer careful blessings, exchange gifts, and move on to the next appointment on a schedule managed down to the minute. What separated October the 8th from an ordinary courtesy visit was the decision to let the letters speak instead of a formal petition, and to let the video carry human voices instead of a translated briefing document. Corbett and the Hope Border Institute had spent months collecting these testimonies specifically because they understood something about how institutions respond to abstraction versus how individual human beings respond to a face and a voice. A statistic about deportation numbers can be filed away. A mother's voice describing her child's confusion cannot. It is also worth dwelling for a moment on what those letters actually said, because the words themselves tell us more about the moment than any description of the Pope's expression can. One writer from a household with mixed immigration status described living in a near, constant state of dread, unsure from one morning to the next whether the family would remain intact by the evening. And in the same breath, remarkably, that writer asked the Pope to pray not for their own protection first, but for the softening of the heart of the very president overseeing the policies that frightened them. A request rooted in a distinctly Catholic instinct toward forgiveness, even amid fear. Another letter, blunter and shorter, simply asked to be heard, a cry from the marginalized addressed directly to the man now sitting a few feet away with the letter in his hands. These were not talking points. They were confessions written by people who had never expected the Pope himself would hold the page. Multiple accounts from those present described Leo's engagement with the material as active, not passive. He did not simply nod along. He asked questions. He read portions of the letters aloud himself, testing the words in his own voice as though he needed to hear them spoken, not just seen on a page to fully register their weight. When the video began to play, According to Corbett's later description, the opening line about the specific crushing feeling of powerlessness seemed to land immediately, as though it named something Leo already recognized. From his own years walking alongside the rural poor of northern Peru, where powerlessness in the face of larger economic and political forces was simply the water people swam in every day. There is a temptation, when telling a story like this one, to treat the Pope's emotional reaction as the entire point, the viral clip, the single dramatic beat, the thing the headline promises. But the more significant story, the one that actually explains why this moment continues to be discussed in Catholic circles months later, is what happened after the cameras were gone and the delegation had flown home. Leo did not simply feel something in that room and move on to his next appointment. In the weeks that followed, migration surfaced repeatedly in his public remarks, framed not as a partisan American controversy, but as a test of the Church's basic commitment to human dignity everywhere it operates. He spoke of the obligation to see the stranger not as a threat to be managed, but as a person made as Catholic. Teaching insists every person is in the image of God. He did so, carefully, never naming individual American political figures directly, choosing instead the timeless vocabulary that popes have always reached for when addressing injustice. A vocabulary built to outlast any single administration or new cycle that restraint matters. It would have been easy after such a visibly emotional audience for critics to accuse Leo of allowing a single American diocese to pull him into domestic partisan politics. Instead, what emerged in the months that followed was consistent universal language about migrants everywhere, not only those at the U.S.-Mexico border, but displaced families across Africa, the Mediterranean crossings that have claimed thousands of lives in Europe, and communities uprooted by conflict in the Middle East and beyond. The El Paso meeting became, in retrospect, not an isolated political flashpoint, but the moment a broader pattern in Leo's papacy became unmistakably visible to a wide public audience for the first time. For the families back in El Paso whose words had made that journey to Rome, the significance was more immediate and more personal. Parishes across the diocese, some of which had quietly reduced public gatherings out of fear that visibility itself carried risk, found in the Pope's own words a kind of cover language from the highest authority in the Church that they could now repeat from the pulpit without stepping outside official teaching. Community organizers like Hilda Villagas, who works directly with families in the Chamazul neighborhood, described a shift in how people spoke about their situation afterward, a sense that their fear had been formally witnessed rather than simply endured. In private, fear does not disappear because a pope cries watching a video, but being seen for communities that often describe themselves as invisible to the wider country can change how a fear is carried. None of this erases the plain human core of the story. A pope sitting in a private room watching ordinary people describe their terror and being unable to keep his composure while doing it. That image endures precisely because it resists the usual language of Vatican diplomacy. It is not a communiqué. It is not a carefully worded statement released through the press office. It is a man reacting in real time to other human beings telling the truth about their lives. And in an institution often criticized for moving slowly, for speaking in careful abstractions, for keeping its most powerful figures at a deliberate remove from the suffering they discuss in encyclicals, that unguarded reaction is exactly what made this moment travel as far and as fast as it did. The Catholic Church has, of course, seen emotional popes before. History remembers John Paul II weeping publicly at gravesites and memorials, his tears becoming part of the visual language of his entire pontificate. It remembers Pope Francis visibly moved during visits to refugee camps on the island of Lampedusa and in Lesbos, choosing at times to bring migrant families back to the Vatican with him, rather than simply offer sympathy from a distance. Emotion, in other words, is not foreign to the papacy. What makes Leo's October audience distinct is not that a pope cried, but the specific undramatic ordinariness of the setting in which it happened. No camera crew staged for the moment, no planned visit to a refugee camp, built for maximum visual impact. Just a private audience room, a borrowed laptop, and letters that were never intended to become public at all. The video only became widely seen afterward when the Hope Border Institute itself chose to share it, giving the wider world a rare, largely unstaged window into how this particular pope actually receives difficult news when no formal statement is expected of him yet. That unstaged quality also connects to something clergy who have observed Leo at Mass have described independently of the October meeting. Multiple accounts from Catholic commentators describe him growing visibly emotional during the consecration, the moment in the liturgy when, according to Catholic belief, the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. Observers have described his eyes filling, a visible swallow, a brief pause as he seems to steady himself before continuing. A columnist for one Catholic outlet described watching the video of that moment, repeatedly drawn back to it, because of how naturally it modeled a kind of spiritual vulnerability rarely seen from the pulpit of St. Peter's. Taken together with the October audience, a picture starts to form of a pope whose public emotional life is unusually legible, not because he seeks attention for it, but because after decades spent as a parish missionary, rather than a career Vatican diplomat, he appears simply never to have developed the practiced neutrality that so often comes with high ecclesiastical office. There is a reason this matters beyond simple human interest. The Catholic Church, like any institution built to endure across centuries, tends to communicate through structures designed to outlast any single person's feelings. Canon law, encyclicals, formal decrees, doctrinal commissions. Those structures exist for good reason. They are what allow the Church to speak with consistency across generations, rather than lurching from one leader's personal impulses to the next. But structures alone rarely change how ordinary believers feel about their own church. What changes that is precisely the kind of moment this documentary has traced. A pope who, faced with real human testimony, responds not first as an administrator, but as a man who spent his life listening to exactly these kinds of stories long before he ever expected to wear white. It is worth returning one final time to the room itself because it is easy, in retelling a story like this, to lose the plain physical facts of what actually happened. A pope sat in a chair. A bishop from Texas handed him a box of letters. An auxiliary bishop held open a laptop. A non-profit director from a border town pressed play on a short video his organization had spent months assembling from the fears of people too frightened to travel to Rome themselves. And somewhere in those 15 minutes watching strangers describe a life he recognized instinctively from his own decades among Peru's rural poor, the leader of the world's largest religious institution stopped being able to hide what he felt. That is not a viral trick. It is not a manufactured headline built around an invented number of seconds. It is simply what happened on the record, witnessed by 5 people who had traveled a long way, specifically hoping without daring to expect it that they might be heard. Historians will eventually decide how this moment fits into the larger record of Leo XIV's papacy, whether it stands as a footnote beside the encyclicals and consistories, or whether it becomes, as some Catholic commentators have already begun to argue, one of the defining images of how this particular pope chose to lead. But for the people who were actually in that room and for the families back in El Paso whose handwriting filled that box of letters, the historical verdict matters less than the plain fact of what already happened. Their words reached Rome. A pope read them, watched their faces on a borrowed laptop screen, and could not pretend, even for the sake of protocol, that what he was seeing did not reach him. In a church built on ritual and formality, that kind of visible, unrehearsed honesty is rare enough to be remembered long after the news cycle that first reported it has moved on to something else entirely. That, in the end, is the story behind the tears. Not a mystery. Not an invented number of seconds, but a 15-minute audience. 100 handwritten letters, and a former missionary who never entirely learned how to watch human suffering from a safe distance, even after becoming pope. If you find value in this kind of careful source coverage of Pope Leo XIV and the Catholic Church, consider subscribing. God bless.